On a morning in March of 1969, a dusty Ford pickup truck with Mexican plates pulled off Highway 56 and stopped in front of a farmhouse that hadn't been lived in for 3 years. Inside the truck were Miguel Rodriguez, his wife Elena, their 3 children, and everything they owned in the world. Miguel was 32 years old. He had sold his father's small farm in Durango for $4,200 every peso the family had accumulated over 3 generations. He had used that money to buy 160 acres of Kansas farmland, sight unseen, from a bank in Garden City that was desperate to unload a property nobody else wanted. The farmhouse had no running water. The barn roof had collapsed. The fields were overgrown with weeds and volunteer wheat gone wild. Elena looked at the property and said nothing. The children, Maria, 10, Carlos, 8, and little Sofia, 4, pressed their faces against the truck window, trying to understand why they had driven for 4 days to reach this broken place. Miguel got out of the truck, walked to the center of what had once been the front yard, and knelt down. He picked up a handful of dirt, brought it to his nose, and smelled it. Then he smiled. "This is good soil," he said in Spanish. "This will grow anything." His neighbor to the east, a man named Harold Benson, was watching from his tractor a quarter-mile away. He would later tell the story at the feed store in town. "Saw the Mexican family pull up to the old Hendricks place," Harold said, shaking his head. "Man got out, grabbed some dirt, and smiled like he'd found gold. I give him 6 months." That was March 1969. Harold Benson's prediction was wrong by about 40 years. Now let me tell you about Miguel Rodriguez, because this story only makes sense if you understand where he came from and what he brought with him. Miguel was born in 1937 in a small village in Durango, in the high desert of northern Mexico. His father, Alejandro, farmed 15 acres of rocky, difficult land that received maybe 8 inches of rain in a good year. Land that most farmers would have called worthless. But Alejandro Rodriguez didn't believe in worthless land. He believed that any soil could produce if you understood it, respected it, and worked with it instead of against it. He taught Miguel everything he knew: how to read the color of soil and know what it needed, how to build irrigation channels that caught every drop of rain and directed it where it would do the most good, how to rotate crops in a 7-year cycle that kept the ground fertile, how to save seeds from the strongest plants and breed them over generations into varieties adapted to your specific land. Most importantly, Alejandro taught Miguel the first rule of farming: never borrow money for land. Never. "Debt is a chain," Alejandro would say. "The bank owns you until the debt is paid. And the debt is never paid because they will always offer you more. Buy what you can afford. Grow what you can grow. Owe nothing to anyone." Miguel learned these lessons working beside his father from the time he could walk. By the time he was 20, he could coax crops from soil that would defeat most farmers. By the time he was 30, he had saved enough money to dream of something bigger. America. Not the America of cities and factories, the America of land. Kansas, Nebraska, the Great Plains, places where a man could buy more acres than his grandfather ever dreamed of. Places where the soil was deep and dark and hungry to produce. Miguel had read about the Homestead Act, about the great waves of immigrants who had turned the prairies into the breadbasket of the world. He believed he could do the same thing. He believed his father's knowledge, adapted to American soil, could build something lasting. So he sold the family farm in Durango. He packed his wife and children into a truck, and he drove north. Let me stop here and tell you what Miguel found when he arrived in Finney County, Kansas, in the spring of because what he found was not the welcoming land of opportunity he had imagined. The first sign of trouble came at the Finney County Agricultural Cooperative. Miguel drove into Garden City on his second day in Kansas, looking to establish an account. The co-op was where farmers bought seed, sold grain, and arranged for services. Without access to the co-op, farming in Finney County would be nearly impossible. The man behind the counter was named Vernon Wells. He was 53 years old, a third-generation Kansas farmer, and the co-op's membership director. Vernon looked at Miguel for a long moment before speaking. "Help you?" I would like to open an account, Miguel said. His English was accented but clear. He had studied for years, knowing this day would come. I have bought the Hendricks property, 160 acres east of... I know the Hendricks place. Vernon's voice was flat. You bought that? Yes, from the First National Bank in Garden City. Vernon leaned back in his chair. The co-op requires a membership application. There's a review process. Background check, credit history, references from established farmers in the area. I understand. I have documentation from my bank in Mexico, and from Mexico. Vernon repeated the words slowly, as if tasting something unpleasant. Mr. Rodriguez, this co-op has been serving American farmers for 43 years. Our members vouch for each other. They know each other's families, their histories, their reputations. I am happy to meet anyone, to introduce my family, to... Let me be frank with you. Vernon stood up, signaling the conversation was ending. We've never had a Mexican member. The other farmers, they wouldn't be comfortable. And frankly, I'm not sure you understand what farming here requires. This isn't Durango. The soil is different. The climate is different. The equipment is different. The whole way of doing things is different. Miguel felt heat rising in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. I have farmed all my life. I know soil. I know you know Mexican soil. This is Kansas. And Kansas farming requires capital, equipment, chemicals, modern methods. Do you have capital, Mr. Rodriguez? I have paid for my land in full. I have some savings for cash buyers. Vernon shook his head. That tells me you couldn't get credit. Banks wouldn't lend to you, which means you'll be farming with whatever broken-down equipment came with that property, using methods from 30 years ago. You'll be bankrupt inside of 2 years. He extended his hand, not to shake, but to point toward the door. I'll save you the membership fee. The answer is no. Find somewhere else to buy your seed. Miguel walked out of the co-op office without another word. He drove home in silence, said nothing to Elena about what had happened, and spent the evening walking his fields alone, feeling the soil between his fingers. That night, after the children were asleep, he told Elena everything. They won't sell to us? Not through the co-op. I'll have to find another way. Elena was quiet for a moment. Will there be another way? There's always another way. Miguel took her hand. My father farmed 15 acres of rock in the desert. We have 160 acres of the best soil in the world. We will find a way. But finding a way was harder than Miguel expected. Now let me tell you about the next few months, because they were the hardest of Miguel's life. The feed store in Garden City suddenly had no record of the seed order Miguel had placed. The equipment dealer refused to service the old tractor that came with the property. The bank that had sold him the land declined to extend a small operating loan, insufficient credit history, they said, though they had been happy enough to take his $4,200 in cash. Word had spread. Vernon Wells had made sure of it. Miguel heard the whispers when he walked through town. Mexican. Doesn't belong here. Taking land that should go to American farmers. Give him a year, he'll be gone. Some people were more direct. One afternoon in April, Miguel was trying to buy fence posts at the lumber yard when a man he didn't recognize walked up to him. You're the Mexican who bought the Hendricks place. I am Miguel Rodriguez. Yes, the man spat on the ground near Miguel's boots. Why don't you go back where you came from? This is American land. It should be farmed by Americans. Miguel looked at the man for a long moment. He thought about his father, about the rocky soil in Durango, about all the people who had told Alejandro Rodriguez that his land was worthless. I am an American now, Miguel said quietly. This is my land. I will farm it. He picked up his fence posts, paid for them at the register where the clerk counted his money 3 times, as if suspecting it might be counterfeit, and drove home. That night, he began building the fence himself, post by post, board by board, using techniques his grandfather had developed in Mexico. The fence wouldn't just mark his property line. It would make a statement. I am here. I am staying. You cannot drive me away. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been somewhere you weren't wanted? A job, a neighborhood, a family gathering where everyone made it clear, through words or silences or looks, that you didn't belong. Miguel Rodriguez lived that feeling every day for the first 3 years in Kansas. Every trip to town was an ordeal. Every interaction with neighbors was a reminder that he was an outsider, an intruder, someone who had no right to be there. But he kept farming. And here's where the story takes its turn. Because while the neighbors were laughing at Miguel Rodriguez, he was doing something they couldn't see. He was learning the land. Every morning before dawn, Miguel walked his fields, not riding, not driving, walking, feeling the soil under his feet, watching how water moved across the land, noting which areas dried quickly and which held moisture, studying the way the wind came from the west and how it affected different parts of the property. He collected soil samples from dozens of locations and tested them himself, using techniques his father had taught him. He discovered that his 160 acres contained at least 4 different soil types, each requiring different treatment. He didn't plant cash crops that first year. Instead, he planted cover crops, legumes and grasses that would fix nitrogen in the soil and build organic matter. His neighbors thought he was crazy. "Rodriguez isn't even planting wheat," Harold Benson reported at the feed store. "He's growing weeds over there. Told you he doesn't know what he's doing." What Harold didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that Miguel was playing a longer game. In Durango, his father had taken 7 years to prepare a new field for planting. 7 years of building soil, establishing natural cycles, creating the conditions for sustainable production. Miguel didn't have 7 years, but he could invest 1. While his neighbors were borrowing money to buy new equipment and chemical fertilizers, Miguel was borrowing nothing. While they were maximizing short-term yields with methods that depleted the soil, Miguel was building something that would last. By 1972, the Rodriguez farm was producing. Not spectacular yields, not the numbers that made other farmers brag at the co-op meetings Miguel still wasn't allowed to attend, but steady, reliable yields that cost almost nothing to produce. Miguel had no debt, no equipment payments, no chemical bills. Every dollar he earned went into the bank or back into the farm. His neighbors had no idea. They still drove past his property and shook their heads at his primitive methods. They still refused to speak to him at the feed store. They still made sure he knew he didn't belong. But something was changing. Slowly, so slowly that nobody noticed at first. The economics of farming were shifting. Now let me tell you about the 1970s, because this is where the story gets complicated. The early 70s were boom years for American agriculture. Export markets opened up, especially to the Soviet Union. Grain prices rose to record levels. Land values skyrocketed. Everyone was making money, and everyone was borrowing. The formula seems simple. Borrow money, buy land, expand operations, make more money, borrow more. Land values kept rising, so the loans were always backed by appreciating assets. Interest rates were manageable. The government was encouraging farmers to plant fence row to fence row. Harold Benson bought another 320 acres in 1973, financed through the Federal Land Bank. His neighbor to the north, a man named Warren Tucker, bought a brand new combine on credit, $60,000, with payments spread over 5 years. The Hoffman brothers, whose family had farmed the same land since 1892, took out a loan to build a new grain storage facility. Everyone was expanding. Everyone was borrowing. Everyone was certain that the good times would last forever. Everyone except Miguel Rodriguez. In 1974, a loan officer from the Garden City Bank visited the Rodriguez farm, a different bank than before. This one had decided that Mexican farmers' money was as good as anyone else's, especially when land values were rising so fast. "Mr. Rodriguez," the loan officer said, sitting at the kitchen table while Elena served coffee, "your property has appreciated significantly since you purchased it. You could easily borrow against that equity, maybe $50,000, and expand your operation, Buy some modern equipment. Increase your acreage. This is the time to grow." Miguel listened politely. He looked at the papers the loan officer had brought, projections showing how much more money he could make with modern methods and expanded land. Then he said, "No, thank you." The loan officer blinked. "I'm sorry. I do not borrow money for land. This is a rule I learned from my father. I will keep farming what I have." "But Mr. Rodriguez, you're leaving money on the table. Every other farmer in the county is expanding. If you don't grow, you'll be left behind." "Then I will be left behind." The loan officer left confused and slightly offended. He told his colleagues about the strange Mexican farmer who refused free money. They all shook their heads. Some people, they agreed, just don't understand how American farming works. The boom continued through 1974, 1976. Prices stayed high. Land values kept climbing. The farmers who had borrowed were making money, on paper at least. Their operations were growing. Their equipment was new. Their yields were impressive. The Rodriguez farm stayed the same, 1,860 acres. Old equipment, maintained and repaired by Miguel himself. Traditional methods that the neighbors still mocked. No debt. And then slowly at first, the world began to change. Let me tell you about the farm crisis, because without understanding it, the rest of this story makes no sense. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. President Carter responded with a grain embargo, cutting off the export market that had driven the boom. Prices began to fall. At the same time, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates to combat inflation. The prime rate, which had been around 6% in the early 70s, climbed to 12% in 19, then 15%, then 20%. Farmers who had borrowed at variable rates suddenly found their payments doubling, tripling. Land values, which had seemed to rise forever, began to fall. The collateral backing all those loans started to disappear. By 1982, the crisis was in full swing. Farm foreclosures were running at levels not seen since the Great Depression. Banks were failing. Small towns were emptying out. Farmers who had worked the same land for generations were losing everything. In Finney County, Kansas, the devastation was profound. Harold Benson, who had expanded so confidently in 1973, couldn't make his payments. The Federal Land Bank foreclosed in 19... Harold and his wife moved to Wichita, where he found work as a mechanic. He never farmed again. Warren Tucker, with his expensive new combine, held on until 1984. When he finally lost the farm, he drove that combine into his barn and set it on fire. The insurance company denied the claim. The Hoffman brothers, whose family had farmed for 4 generations, split up in 19... One brother moved to Denver. The other stayed in a small apartment in Garden City, working at a grain elevator, watching strangers farm his family's land. One by one, the farms around the Rodriguez property went under. Foreclosure signs appeared on fence posts. Auction notices filled the local newspaper. Equipment sat rusting in fields where nothing grew. And through it all, Miguel Rodriguez kept farming. Now let me tell you what happened in the spring of 1985, because this is where the story reaches its turning point. By that spring, Miguel Rodriguez was one of only 3 working farms left in his section of Finney County. The other 2 were large corporate operations that had bought up foreclosed properties at pennies on the dollar. Miguel's 160 acres stood like an island of green in a sea of brown and abandoned land. The neighbors who remained, those who hadn't lost everything, who were barely hanging on, began to notice. The Rodriguez place, which they had mocked for 15 years, was thriving. His wheat was healthy, his soil was dark and rich, his equipment, ancient as it was, ran perfectly, and he owed nothing to anyone. One afternoon in April, Vernon Wells, the same Vernon Wells who had refused Miguel membership in the co-op 16 years earlier, drove up the Rodriguez driveway in a pickup truck that was no longer new. Miguel was in the barn, repairing a cultivator. He looked up when he heard the truck, recognized Vernon, and went back to his work. Vernon stood in the barn doorway for a long moment before speaking. "Rodriguez, Mr. Wells. Vernon cleared his throat. The co-op's having some trouble. Lost a lot of members these past few years. Foreclosures and such. Miguel said nothing. He continued working on the cultivator. We're looking to rebuild. Bring in some new blood. And I was thinking, Vernon trailed off, clearly struggling with what he had come to say. Yes? I was thinking maybe you'd like to join if you're interested. Membership fees been waived given the circumstances. Miguel set down his wrench. He walked over to where Vernon was standing and looked at the man who had told him 16 years ago that Mexican farmers didn't belong in Kansas. Why now, Mr. Wells? What has changed? Vernon looked at the ground. Everything's changed. Everybody's broke or gone. You're the only one left who knows how to farm without, he gestured vaguely, without all the stuff we thought we needed. The chemicals, the loans, the new equipment, all of it. Vernon finally met Miguel's eyes. I was wrong about you, we all were. You knew something we didn't know, and now everyone who laughed at you is gone, and you're still here. Miguel was quiet for a long moment. He thought about all the years of being refused, all the whispers and insults, all the times he had been told to go back to Mexico, that he didn't belong, that American land was for American farmers. He could have said no. He could have told Vernon Wells to leave his property and never come back. He could have savored his victory over the people who had treated him with contempt for 16 years. But that wasn't what his father had taught him. I will join your co-op, Mr. Wells, Miguel said, and I will teach anyone who wants to learn. Teach them what? What my father taught me. How to farm without debt, how to build soil instead of depleting it, how to survive when the banks and the markets turn against you. Vernon nodded slowly. Some folks might not want to learn from a... He stopped himself. From a Mexican? I was going to say from an outsider. But yeah, that too. Then they will lose their farms, and I will still be here. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a boast. It was simply a statement of fact, the same quiet certainty that had carried Miguel through 16 years of rejection and isolation. Vernon Wells held out his hand. Miguel shook it. Welcome to the co-op, Vernon said. 16 years late, but welcome. Let me jump forward now, because the next few years are where the seeds Miguel planted, literally and figuratively, finally bore fruit. Word spread about the Mexican farmer who had survived the crisis. Farmers from other counties came to visit, to see his methods, to ask questions. Extension agents from Kansas State University arrived to study his soil, which had none of the degradation they were seeing elsewhere. Miguel taught anyone who would listen. He showed them his father's techniques for building soil fertility. He explained his 7-year crop rotation, which kept the ground healthy without expensive chemicals. He demonstrated his irrigation methods, developed in the deserts of Durango and adapted to the Kansas plains. Some farmers were too proud to learn from a Mexican immigrant. They continued doing things the old way, borrowing, expanding, depleting, and most of them eventually failed. But others listened. They swallowed their pride, came to Miguel's farm, and learned. Many of them saved their operations. By 1990, Miguel Rodriguez was the most respected farmer in Finney County. Not the richest, he never tried to be rich, but the most respected. When young farmers had questions, they came to him. When the Extension Service needed a demonstration of sustainable methods, they used his fields. When agricultural magazines wrote about farmers who had survived the crisis, his name came up again and again. The co-op that had rejected him now held its annual meeting in his barn. Let me tell you about one more thing that happened, because without it, this story isn't complete. In 1993, Harold Benson came back to Finney County. He was 68 years old. He had spent 10 years in Wichita, working as a mechanic, watching from a distance as his former neighbors lost their farms. His wife had died 2 years earlier. He had nothing left in the city. He came back to see the land he had lost, to visit the graves of his parents in the Garden City Cemetery, to remember what his life had been before everything fell apart. He drove past his old property, now owned by a corporation from Denver, and didn't recognize it. The farmhouse where he'd been born had been torn down. The land was farmed by contractors who never saw the soil, who just applied chemicals from automated equipment. Then he drove past the Rodriguez place. The farm was beautiful. The fields were green and healthy. The farmhouse had been expanded, improved, painted. Children were playing in the yard. Miguel's grandchildren, Harold realized, 3 generations on land that had been considered worthless. Harold pulled his truck to the side of the road and sat there for a long time, looking at what Miguel had built. Eventually, he got out and walked up the driveway. Miguel was sitting on the porch, watching the sunset. He was 66 years old now, his hair fully gray, his hands still strong from decades of work. "Mr. Benson," Miguel said, "it has been a long time." Harold nodded. He couldn't speak at first. There was too much to say and no good way to say it. "I came to—" He stopped, tried again. "I wanted to tell you something I should have said a long time ago. Please, sit down." Harold sat in the chair next to Miguel. They looked out over the fields together. The same fields Harold had dismissed as unworkable all those years ago. "I was wrong about you," Harold said finally. "When you first came here, I told everyone you'd be gone in 6 months. I laughed at the way you farmed. I thought—" He shook his head. "I thought I knew everything, and you knew nothing. I remember. I'm sorry. For all of it. The things I said, the way we treated you, you didn't deserve any of it." Miguel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you know what my father told me when I was young? He said that land does not care who owns it. The land does not see Mexican or American, rich or poor, educated or simple. The land only asks one question: will you take care of me? If you say yes, and you mean it, the land will take care of you." That's a nice thought. It is not just a thought. It is the truth. Everyone who treated this land as something to exploit, to borrow against, to squeeze for maximum yield, to use up and throw away, everyone lost. The ones who survived are the ones who understood that farming is a partnership with the land. Harold nodded slowly. "I wish I'd understood that 30 years ago. You understand it now. That is what matters." They sat together until the sun went down. 2 old farmers, one who had lost everything, one who had kept everything, watching the Kansas twilight turn the wheat fields gold. Before Harold left, Miguel gave him something. A small notebook, leather-bound, filled with handwriting in Spanish. "What is this?" "My father's notes. His techniques for building soil, conserving water, farming without debt. I have translated the important parts into English." Miguel smiled. "It is too late for you to farm again, but perhaps you could teach others. Perhaps you could help young farmers understand what we both learned in very different ways." Harold looked at the notebook like it was made of gold. "Why would you give this to me? After everything?" "Because hatred serves no one. Because the land needs people who understand it. And because my father taught me that the greatest victory is not defeating your enemies, it is turning them into friends." Harold Benson spent the last years of his life teaching workshops at the county extension office. He used Miguel's notebook and his own hard experience to help young farmers avoid the mistakes that had destroyed his generation. He died in 1998, at peace. Let me end this story where it began, at the Rodriguez farm, on that March morning when a dusty pickup truck pulled off Highway 56 and stopped in front of a broken-down farmhouse. Miguel Rodriguez is 91 years old now. He no longer works the fields. His son Carlos and grandson Miguel Jr. handle the farming, but every morning, just after dawn, he walks out to the fence he built in 1969 and looks at his land. The farm has grown to 480 acres, bought piece by piece with cash as neighbors sold out over the decades. The methods haven't changed. No debt, no chemicals, soil health above everything. The yields are consistent. The land is thriving. The family is secure. 3 generations work that land now. They speak English and Spanish with equal ease. They know the techniques Alejandro Rodriguez developed in Durango nearly a century ago, and they've adapted them to Kansas conditions. They are American farmers on American land, using knowledge that came from Mexico. The co-op that rejected Miguel in 1969 named their annual Sustainable Farming Award after him. The university that once dismissed his methods now teaches them to students from around the world. The town that told him to go back to Mexico now celebrates him as a pioneer. But Miguel doesn't care much about awards or recognition. What he cares about is the land. Every morning he picks up a handful of soil and smells it. The same thing he did on that first day, when he knew nothing about Kansas except that the dirt was good. "This is good soil," he says to himself. "This will grow anything." And it does. So the next time someone tells you that you don't belong somewhere, that your methods are wrong, your background is wrong, your very presence is unwelcome, remember Miguel Rodriguez. Remember that the people who laughed at him are gone. Their farms are corporate property now, worked by machines and strangers. Their children moved to cities and forgot what their grandparents built. But Miguel's land is still in his family. His grandchildren know his father's techniques. His methods are spreading to new generations of farmers who understand that sustainability beats exploitation every time. The town said Mexican farmers don't belong in Kansas. 60 years later, the Rodriguez family is the only original farm still standing. Some questions answer themselves.